Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar focusing on achievement. My name is Tracy Fielding and I am the Deputy Director for Schools and Early Education. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This afternoon I am joined by Tim Jenner, Senior HMI in the Schools Policy Team, and one of our colleagues from Ofsted's Data and Insight Team, Muro Diamond, Team Leader for School Pre-Inspection Data and Insight. We are going to turn off our cameras just so that you can concentrate on the content, but you'll see us again towards the end when we come to your questions. Thank you to everybody who has pre-submitted a question. We've tried to weave as many of these as possible into the presentation, but please do keep popping your questions into the questions box and we'll answer as many as we can as we go along. In December, we hosted our first webinar on the new achievement evaluation area to coincide with the beginning of inspection under our renewed framework. This webinar will be reiterating and reinforcing some of the messages we shared with you in December, whilst also providing you all with an overview of the changes in the IDSR for the academic year 2026-27, including how inspectors will use the similar schools data, which will be introduced from September. We have recently republished our updated toolkit and operating guide with minor updates for September. If you haven't seen these already, you can find them on our website. Let's start by recapping what we mean when we talk about achievement. As you know, we introduced a new evaluation area focused on achievement in our renewed framework. Our renewed framework was designed to allow greater nuance in our reporting on inspection, celebrating schools' successes, validating the positive impact of leaders' work, and highlighting where there is more to do. A separate evaluation area on achievement ensures that we can capture clearly the impact of each school's work on pupils' knowledge and skills and their preparation for their next steps. By separating achievement from curriculum and teaching, we can also recognise better where schools are on a journey. For example, where improvements in curriculum and teaching are underway, but where more time may be needed for these to be having a significant impact on pupils' achievement. The most important point to emphasise is that we define achievement broadly as a combination of several interconnected factors. Inspectors gather evidence about all of these aspects of achievement to build a rounded picture of achievement in a school. These factors are summarised on page 27 of our Schools Inspection Toolkit. We are very clear that pupils' outcomes in tests and examinations matter. Exam results and qualifications open doors and create opportunities for pupils, and we cannot overlook their importance. But achievement is broader than test scores or qualifications. It's about pupils fulfilling their potential and thriving. It's the child who begins school struggling to form a sentence and leaves able to express their ideas with confidence. It's the young person who discovers a passion that transforms their future. A key part of our evaluation of achievement is how well pupils secure their foundational knowledge in language and communication, reading, writing, and mathematics. This is absolutely fundamental to pupils' achievement and their ability to access the curriculum. It is an essential prerequisite of pupils developing the detailed knowledge and skills that they need across the curriculum, as well as the confidence they need for later success. We also consider the progress that pupils make from their starting points and how this enables them to develop detailed knowledge and skills across the curriculum, and how pupils apply these to produce high quality work. The qualifications that pupils achieve is another part of the picture. These are the formal certificates and grades the pupils earn, and they are a reflection of the knowledge and skills that pupils have learned, as well as a gateway to their next steps. Beyond these qualifications, there is everything else that prepares pupils for their next steps, be that further education, employment, adulthood, and/or training. This is about how well pupils are prepared to move on from the school and thrive. Each of these elements is interconnected. The ability to read well supports pupils to gain deeper knowledge about the curriculum. This knowledge leads to better qualifications. All of this contributes to pupils being ready and well prepared for what comes next. You will be aware that we've also sharpened our focus on inclusion across our framework, including in how we consider achievement. This includes the achievement of pupils with special educational needs or disabilities and those supported by the pupil premium. But we are also now explicit about other pupils whose achievement we also need to shine a light on, such as pupils with caring responsibilities, those who are known to children's social care, and any other pupils who face barriers to their learning or well-being. Our case sampling approach on all inspections helps us to understand better the starting points of some of these pupils, the barriers they face, the support they receive, and the impact of the school's work to ensure that all pupils achieve the best possible outcomes and are ready for the next steps. By considering the progress that pupils make from their starting points, as well as pupils' attainment, inspectors can build a rounded picture of achievement for all pupils. As HMCI has previously said, inclusive schools are high-achieving schools. They are schools which set high standards and expect and ensure that all pupils achieve them. I will now hand over to Tim, who will take us through how inspectors build a picture of achievement on inspection.
Thank you, Tracy. So when inspectors start to gather evidence about achievement, it's important to realise that they're drawing always on two main sources of evidence. One of those is the published data which is available in the IDSR. But the other really crucial part of that picture is the wide range of evidence that inspectors gather on site about achievement in a school. The published data is presented in the IDSR, which most of you will be familiar with. What it does is gives inspectors some insight into the outcomes and qualifications and pupils' readiness for their next stage. Those of you who joined us back in December or have looked at this since will recognise that we've carefully redesigned the IDSR for the renewed framework to give inspectors and schools a really clear and deep insight into their data and what that might indicate about achievement in their school. But the IDSR isn't just about published outcomes. The first and one of the most crucial parts of the IDSR sets out the data that can help inspectors to understand a school's context better. For example, the proportion of pupils who are disadvantaged or those who have special educational needs or disabilities, as well as other contextual information such as how often pupils move into a school at non-standard times. That data is a really important starting point for discussions with leaders about their context, which is a key theme of that first phone call discussion with leaders. But throughout the inspection, inspectors will really seek to understand every school's unique context and keep that in mind as they build a picture of achievement in the school. Inspectors will also use the outcomes data in the IDSR as a further starting point for discussions with leaders as part of those phone calls on the day before an inspection. And what inspectors will want to discuss is to hear what the school are doing to ensure the best possible achievement for all pupils and how they're addressing any areas where pupils may not be achieving as well as they could. When they review the evidence in the IDSR, inspectors will really carefully consider what the data might suggest about achievement, but will also be really aware of the gaps and the limitations in the data. For example, where there are small cohorts or where data might not capture pupils' progress, as it might not, for example, for some pupils with SEND. Page 28 of our toolkit sets out really clearly how inspectors will consider data as part of their evaluation and some of the ways in which inspectors are cautious about their use of data as a source of evidence on inspection. That information in the IDSR about both context and achievement and the discussion with leaders, taken together, help inspectors to identify the right areas of focus for their inspection activities. ensuring that the team can see and celebrate areas of strength in the school, that they can explore those areas where leaders' work is having an impact and validate the impact of leaders' actions, and also, of course, help us to work towards being able to highlight any areas where there is more work to do. Once they're on site, inspectors gather a really wide range of evidence to build a fuller picture of achievement. We know full well that many aspects of a school's work are not always reflected clearly in published data. And our on-site evidence helps us, for example, to understand the progress pupils are making across the curriculum, consider how quickly pupils are securing the foundations of later learning. To gather that evidence, inspectors will visit a wide range of lessons, they'll look at pupils' work, and they'll speak to pupils in depth about their learning. Across the inspection team will be building a really rounded picture of achievement in the school, bringing together the evidence about achievement in the IDSR with the evidence gathered on site in order to consider all of those important aspects of achievement that Tracy outlined earlier. I've mentioned the information in the IDSR about context already, and an understanding of each school's unique context is central to every inspection of a school. Inspectors take that context into account in how they plan the inspection and how they gather and evaluate evidence across the course of the inspection. Taking context into account might involve simple adjustments, such as timing lesson visits around an unusual school day, but it may also involve complex inspection activity, such as building our understanding of the starting points and barriers and progress of a particular cohort of pupils, such as those who've joined the school mid-year, in order to understand their achievement in context. A lot has been made of our use of national averages as a benchmark for one aspect of our evaluation of achievement. Now, in many schools, those who serve relatively typical cohorts, a comparison to national averages gives a broad but relatively fair indication of achievement over time. However, inspectors always use these benchmarks really cautiously, and this is particularly true where a school is serving a cohort of pupils which is not typical. When that's the case, we know that a comparison to all pupil national averages is going to be less useful, as the starting points of pupils in the school may not be average. For schools with a high proportion of pupils who are disadvantaged, for example, inspectors will pay particular attention to comparisons with national averages for disadvantaged pupils, which give a fairer indication of pupils' achievement in those schools. But beyond that, where a significant number of pupils face overlapping vulnerabilities, even those comparisons can be misleading, which is why inspectors always seek to understand the school's context in detail. By introducing similar schools data into the IDSR, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly, we'll have an additional layer of information to help us understand pupils' achievement in context. That nuance around understanding achievement in context is captured really well in our grading standards for achievement. The measured language in the expected standard here is really deliberate, and it's there to help inspectors evaluate achievement in each school fairly. Firstly, if you notice the use of the phrase "on the whole," which reflects the natural variation that we see in any school. It allows inspectors to apply grading standards with a secure fit by making sure that the standard itself represents a reasonable rather than an unrealistic bar. In this particular standard, the word "typically" is particularly important. While inspectors will use a secure fit to apply this standard that on the whole pupils achieve well, that word "typically" makes it clear that the rest of the standard will not always apply. This is where our rounded view of achievement, considering pupils' attainment alongside the progress they make from their starting points, and drawing on evidence from the IDSR and from a range of inspection activity, will really support inspectors to come to the right grading decision. This careful wording of our toolkit grading standard is all about getting the balance right between consistent inspection, which is fair to all schools, particularly those working in challenging circumstances. This wording shows what we mean when we say that inspectors will use a secure fit, but not an exact fit. Pupils' outcomes are really important, as Tracy has said, and so it's right that any school meeting the expected standard should meet this expectation that on the whole pupils achieve well. However, our wording and how we use those standards on inspection is securely consistent, but it's not rigid or inflexible. Inspectors know that in atypical schools or for individual pupils who face significant barriers, success may look slightly different, and it may not always be reflected in published outcomes. This ensures that we get that balance right. Without a secure fit model, there could be a danger of inconsistency, with some schools being held accountable for pupils' outcomes where others are not. Or a danger of us lowering our expectations for certain pupils by turning a blind eye to poor performance over time in a minority of schools, which means that pupils, and particularly the most vulnerable, are not achieving as well as they could. But the careful wording of our toolkit ensures that we can have the same expectations in every school and for different groups of pupils, that pupils will achieve well, but that we can recognise that this may look different and indeed very different in some cases, allowing us to celebrate those schools who are making a real difference for these pupils, as well as highlight where there may be more to do. As we've discussed, the IDSR is one key tool which inspectors use to support their understanding of achievement in a school. We made a major update to the IDSR at the start of the renewed framework, and feedback from schools and from inspectors has been very positive about the clarity of this new look IDSR. We've made some further refinements, and I'll hand over to Muro now to share these with you so you know what to expect in your IDSR from September. And of course, that will include how similar schools data will be incorporated into the IDSR to give an even fuller and fairer picture of achievement in the schools.
Thank you, Tim. So here is a brief summary of the upcoming changes to the IDSR. The most prominent of these is the introduction of similar schools data, which I'll go through in more detail. This year, we will see the reintroduction of EYFS school level data, including contextualized GLD, and up-to-date progress data for Key Stage 2. We are also doing some further work on capturing context in the IDSR by adding data on overlapping contextual characteristics, where pupils share more than one characteristic, which is typically linked to lower achievement. We hope to be able to share more on this soon. We have also further refined the layout of the IDSR, building on our earlier introduction of a summary table of key measures and trends. Supporting charts will now be moved to an annex at the end of the document to help schools and inspectors prioritize the most helpful information. In most important ways, the IDSR is staying exactly the same, including in methodology, which sits behind our data. For example, the way we calculate your school's performance relative to the national picture. So what is the similar schools model? Well, ultimately, this is a refined lens through which inspectors can view your school's academic outcomes. Inspectors can use this to help shape their understanding of pupils' achievement with your specific context. That's the important part. Similar schools data is an additional layer of information. It isn't a new headline performance measure, and it won't replace or supersede the information which is already in the IDSR. What it will do is help inspectors to understand this information better in context. This additional layer of information will be helpful in schools operating in more challenging contexts, such as those with above average proportions of pupils eligible for free school meals. In these schools, it can highlight the positive impact the school is having on pupils where this is not necessarily reflected in headline data. Similar schools data is just another part of the picture, which will help inspectors to form that rounded view of achievement, which Tim mentioned previously. The model on which similar schools data is based works in 2 stages. I will outline this briefly, but you can refer to the published technical guide for further detail. Firstly, a regression-based approach is used to identify and quantify the relationship between school-level characteristics and pupil outcomes. This identifies variables which typically best predict pupils' ultimate attainment, but over which schools have limited direct control. We use Attainment 8 at Key Stage 4 and scaled scores in reading and maths at Key Stage 2 because they provide broad, stable, and nationally recognized indicators of pupils' achievement. The output of this first stage is a set of weighted characteristics, with the weighting reflecting the relative importance in explaining the differences in attainment across schools. As you would expect, pupils' prior attainment and the proportion of pupils facing different types of disadvantage are important variables. The school is then grouped with the 50 schools which are closest to it based on these characteristics. This produces your unique similar schools group. We can then identify the average outcomes for this group and see how your school compares to this. That means that the model allows us to compare your schools to other schools which are much more similar to yours in terms of pupil starting points and the barriers they typically face. Here we can see an example of how the similar schools data will be displayed in the IDSR. This is taken from the summary table section of the IDSR and shows the performance of all pupils at the school. On the left of the image, you can see pupils' achievement across a range of measures. This is the same data which is currently displayed in the IDSR. In this example, the summary chart shows that pupils at this school are achieving outcomes that sit below the national average for all pupils. However, on the right of this image, you can see how this performance compares to that of other similar schools. Here you can see that several measures, including headline measures such as Attainment 8, sit above those with similar context. This is shown by the blue boxes. The colour scales we are using here are important. As we have said, similar schools is an additional layer of contextual information for inspectors. Therefore, we have chosen to display this data using the same colour scales, blue, grey and orange, used with other contextual information in the IDSR, such as the percentage of pupils for eligible for FSM, rather than using the colour scales we use for headline performance measures. This is a key part of interpreting the similar schools data. It helps us understand whether a school's outcomes stand out from similar schools in a statistically reliable way. I will now hand back to Tim to talk through how inspectors will use this information.
Thank you, Muro. Just to reiterate, as we've said already, similar schools data is an additional layer of information that's really designed to help inspectors understand your pupils' achievement in your school's context. And it's particularly helpful in schools operating in more challenging contexts, where the positive impact of their work may not always be clearly reflected in headline measures. The similar schools model is displayed through all the key areas of the achievement section within the IDSR. For example, here you can see how the performance of disadvantaged pupils compares to those within the similar schools group for the same school that Muro just shared in his example for all pupils. So what will inspectors do with this information? Well, an inspector looking at this data would recognise two important qualifications to the picture presented by the all pupil data, that table on the left, which suggested that performance was below national averages. Firstly, just as we do now in any school with a high proportion of pupils who are disadvantaged, inspectors would look at the performance of disadvantaged pupils in the school and consider how that compares to disadvantaged pupils nationally. That's the table on the left. That immediately complicates the picture of this school compared to the largely red summary table which we saw previously for all pupil performance in this school. Although all pupil performance looks to be below average, the fact that disadvantaged pupils have typically performed closer to or even above the average for disadvantaged pupils nationally suggests that some of that all pupil performance may be explained more by the makeup of the school's cohort than the work of the school. And in schools like this, inspectors would be looking to the on-site evidence to build that rounded picture of achievement, particularly considering the progress that pupils make from their starting points to evaluate whether pupils on the whole are achieving well in this school. Secondly, and this is the bit that's going to be new from September, inspectors will also have the similar schools data to make this picture clearer. This data, the blue and grey boxes on the right, suggests that in this school, pupils may make better progress and achieve better than they do in schools with similar contexts. With this additional layer of information, it becomes more likely that this is a school where the headline all pupil data may actually be masking the school's success in supporting all pupils to achieve well, regardless of their barriers and starting points. If the on-site evidence supports this view, then inspectors will have even greater confidence than previously, thanks to this similar schools data, in coming to a grade of expected standard for such a school. So as we discussed earlier, similar schools data is going to be particularly helpful in sharpening our understanding of achievement in context in those schools where significant contextual challenges can mean that headline all pupil performance may not fully or fairly capture the whole story of pupils' achievement in the school. Another area where this data may be particularly useful is as an additional layer of information about performance in the very best schools. Here you can see the similar schools data for a school which was recently graded exceptional for achievement. As you might expect, as well as very strong headline performance, it's clear that pupils in this school also achieve significantly better than they might in similar schools and appear to have done so over time. Of course, some schools will also have outcomes below that of the averages for their similar schools. In our view, that's really helpful information for you as school leaders, because it may help you to identify where there is more you could do to ensure the best possible outcomes for all pupils in your school, given your context. The DFE's partner tool to similar schools, which is soon to be released, will help you identify and even contact similar schools who may be able to help you further refine your own practice for the benefit of your pupils. But on its own, similar schools data, which is below the group average, is likely to be less useful for inspectors than data that shows that a school sits above the average for its group. Remember that our grading standards have not changed. If the on-site evidence and the IDSR suggest that on the whole pupils achieve well, even if they do not do as well as similar schools, then this might suggest that there are factors in leaders' control, for example, in the curriculum and teaching, which could support even better outcomes for pupils. As contextual information, it will not, however, change the overall picture of achievement where this suggests that pupils broadly achieve well. So, in summary, first of all, as Tracy outlined, achievement is really broadly defined in our inspection toolkit. It includes pupils' progress from their starting points, the knowledge and skills they develop across the curriculum. It does, of course, include the outcomes and qualifications they gain, as well as their readiness for next steps, both in terms of their qualifications, but their wider preparation for future success. In every school, inspectors focus on building a rounded view of achievement from the evidence in the IDSR and a range of inspection activities which they carry out on site. And any published data used by inspectors is treated with caution and carefully contextualized. When coming to grading decisions, inspectors use a secure fit, but this is not the same as an exact fit. We really do understand that success may look different in different contexts or for different individuals. And for that reason, understanding context is central to every inspection. Similar schools data will help inspectors to better understand achievement in a school in context. And it's particularly helpful in highlighting positive achievement in schools working in challenging circumstances where this may not be as clearly reflected in headline data. I'm going to hand back to Tracy now, who is going to take us through some of the questions that hopefully have come in while we've been talking.
Thank you, Tim. And we're going to put our cameras back on now because we're just going to go through some of those questions that were pre-submitted. So what we've done is we've put those into summary areas and themes. So once we've sort of put those into things, we'll then have a look at some of the questions in the chat bar. So one of the questions was focused on similar school calculations and how do we get access to the similar schools data? Will schools know which schools they're being compared to, and will they be able to challenge this? I'm just going to hand over to Tim and Muro for that question.
Yeah, I can help with that one, Tracy. So yeah, similar schools information will be available in two places. The first, as we mentioned in a webinar, is the IDSR to support inspectors and contextualize what the data tells about your school, the data tells us about your school. The other tool is managed by the DFE, which will support schools to identify other similar schools they may want to reach out to. The DFE tool will allow schools to see all of the schools in their similar schools group, and the DFE plan to release that tool in autumn. In the meantime, if schools do have questions about their similar schools data, they can email us on school.performance.data@ofsted.gov.uk.
Great, thank you, Muro. And there was a lot of questions around special educational needs and disabilities and how that is all covered. So some of those questions, which I know have come through in the chat as well, is about how this will be contextualised for SEND pupils who don't attain national qualification, considering assessment in SEND settings in special schools, and considering how we will grade schools that perhaps can manipulate their performance statistics by not taking out their fair share of children with SEND. So there were a lot of questions around that. Muro, can you help with that in terms of the special schools?
Yeah, of course. So special schools will not have similar schools data, as we do not use external achievement data for special schools. Only schools with attainment outcomes for either Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 4 will get a group and subsequent analysis. As such, groups and associated analysis will only be applied to measures relating to Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4 also. Tracy, I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that?
Yes, I was thinking that in terms of schools with high numbers of pupils with SEND, the similar school tool will enable those fairer comparisons with schools with pupils with similar levels of prior attainment. So in that way, it's that fairness of looking across at those that are in similar contextual situations. For instance, including comparing schools to others with similar percentage of educational healthcare plans and census support. But in all cases, our evidence about achievement comes from that range of sources beyond the IDSR. And I noticed that there were some questions in the chat bar saying there's preconceived ideas before we come in looking at the IDSR. But actually, as Tim has reiterated, context is really taken into consideration. And as a policy team, what we have done is we have ensured that inspectors are really trained to make sure that they really do consider that context. So we are really reiterating that in all of our training, which you will be able to access once we have completed it in September, about context being absolutely key to this. And we are interested in what schools do to support pupils move on from their starting points. And we know that in specialist settings, these starting points can be really varied and sometimes very complex according to need. And it's always linked to pupils' needs, attendance, and all of their experiences. We will also, just to add here in terms of SEND, we will also want to explore achievement on site. So when we think about our inspection methodology, we want to look at how well pupils secure their foundational knowledge, whatever their starting point is, and how will they read that at an appropriate level, how they make progress from their starting points by securing that knowledge they need before undertaking more complex tasks. And as I said right at the beginning, how well prepared they are for the next stages of their lives. The similar schools data does give us further important context, which we can balance really carefully with the evidence that we actually collect on site. Some of the other questions that we've had, and speaking to grammar school heads a few weeks ago, we absolutely dealt with some of these questions, was about the non-selective schools. And I know that we've had some questions about that. Tim, I wondered whether you'd pick that up.
Yeah, of course. You're right. We've had a few questions about what this will mean for non-selective schools operating in areas with selective schools in the local area. I mean, the first thing, if we talk about similar schools first and then about achievement more broadly, it's the first thing to say, of course, is that the similar schools data compares you to schools with similar characteristics, and one of the key measures in there is prior attainment. So that means you're not being compared to your local schools, but nationally to similar schools or schools that are more like yourself. So again, the similar schools data should enable us, as it will in many different ways, to have a fairer comparison of achievement in a particular school to schools that are more like it nationally. Obviously, even with that in mind, operating as a non-selective school in a selective area is an additional level of context, and it's one that we would expect to discuss in detail with school leaders on any inspection. And that's why that's such a key part of the discussion from that initial phone call and throughout the inspection, to help us really understand the particular context of every individual school, in order to make sense of any of the particular pressures or challenges or barriers that the school faces, so we can take that context into account when we think about achievement in the round.
Thank you, Tim. Another question that we frequently receive, and also do receive a lot on inspection, is all about internal data. And it asks if we're going to look at internal data and if it adds to that evidence towards a grading descriptor. And we're also asked about how it will be viewed, why internal data is looked at, and do we actually look at internal data such as predictions or any trends that are going on. And what I would say to that is, in terms of internal data, we are always really interested in what internal data tells you as leaders. but we don't want to explore the figures in depth. We want to check out whether what your data matches, what your data says matches what is actually happening on the ground. So our methodology at the moment in this renewed framework really does depend on us going out with leaders, seeing what's happening, you talking to us about what happens on a day-to-day basis, and then us talking about what you know, why you make the decisions you do based on what you know. And those decisions are what informs the grade descriptor in terms of what we see and the evidence that we gather throughout the inspection. So it's really important that leaders have that opportunity to discuss what they know about the pupils in their school, the progress that they make, and how you know, and what decisions you make because of that. We've also have a lot of questions about different challenging contexts, and we've talked a little bit about context because it is absolutely key and fundamental to this renewed framework. But we've had questions like how the judgment for achievement changes if inspecting in a 14 to 19 studio school with no pupils in Key Stage 3. So lots of contextual information. How data is used in small schools comes across quite routinely. Thinking about achievement data, what that looks like in first schools, middle schools, juniors, and thinking where there's no data to look at, nursery schools, for example. So also thinking about all through schools, which are equally ones that we really do think about and consider in terms of achievement. So Tim, Muro, do you want to take that one up?
Muro, do you want to start with some of the technicalities around similar schools data and sort of where and when it is or isn't applied? Because we've had quite a few on those in the chat as well, and then I'll come in more broadly.
Yeah, of course. In terms of the model and the variables used, school type, for example, isn't actually factored in as a variable. So if we take as an example an all through school, they will have two separate similar school groups, one based on the Key Stage 2 element of the school and one based on the Key Stage 4 element. The characteristics of the whole school are used in the model, not just those relating to those separate phases.
Thanks, Muro. And in terms of the broader picture on inspection, including how we use published data, but also how we consider achievement in different types of school, it's worth pointing people again to the information in the toolkit that is outside of the grading standards. So each of our toolkit evaluation areas has a sort of preamble and then some really useful information around how inspectors will gather evidence about that particular evaluation area. And achievement is no different, so it's got a lot of information in there. It sets out really clearly and in black and white some of the things we've talked about on this webinar. For example, how context will be considered, how published data will be treated cautiously. But it also has specific reference to particular types of schools, studio schools and UTCs, for example. It flags how cautious we need to be with progress data in schools where pupils typically join at non-standard times. We've also, through further consultation across the renewed framework, made other changes, such as removing progress data from the IDSR for UTCs with that in mind. But of course, the underlying message here is that we inspect a very, very wide range of schools, and many schools that we inspect potentially have no published data. Pupils might be on very different routes or gain very different qualifications. In every school, we're able to come to an evaluation about achievement, and that really goes back to those initial points about the fact that achievement is really broad. It covers all of those different areas that Tracy outlined. The evidence we gather is really broad. Published data where it's available is a part of that, but it's always connected to what we gather on site. And in many schools, we only have on-site evidence and don't have published data in the IDSR. So that connected conversation about the school's context, where published data is available, the published data, and then the evidence we gather on site is all put together in the round. We've obviously introduced new approaches in inspections under the renewed framework, such as case sampling, which gives us even more ability to really understand the starting points and the specific barriers of some individuals in the school, so we can build an even better picture of that progress from starting points, which is obviously particularly important if the outcomes that pupils go on to achieve perhaps look slightly different, or if success for some pupils is slightly different to what it might be in many mainstream schools because of their starting points or particular barriers. All of this helps us build that much more holistic, nuanced picture about what achievement looks like, and ultimately answer that key question of whether pupils are achieving well in the school, even if that looks slightly different in different settings.
Thank you, Tim. And the final theme was around schools being more disadvantaged, with more disadvantaged pupils more likely to be disadvantaged. Lots of questions about this, some in the chat, and notice there about starting points as well, and thinking about how our methodology in this renewed framework really does give us the opportunity as inspectors to work with leaders to see how leaders have determined the starting points, what that looks like for leaders and what they've done about it. But we do, we do not wish to lower standards for pupils who are disadvantaged, and that this renewed framework really does focus on making sure that that doesn't happen. And we recognise to date that the achievement grades have been lower for some schools in the above average band compared to those schools in the below average band. But despite this, nearly 3/5 of the school with above average free school meals were graded expected standard or better. And when we've looked at evidence bases, this is all about that context and the discussions that we have with leaders, exactly about the things that Tim, Muro and I have talked about during this webinar. We have trained inspectors to think really deeply and carefully about national averages and how typical your school is. And we also recognise that in some schools, you have higher levels of deprivation and pupils with free school meals, and comparing you to national averages can be problematic because you may not be that typical school. So all of those discussions will take place as part of our renewed framework methodology. In these instances, we do ask that inspectors look and consider data about how well disadvantaged achievement compares to the disadvantaged pupils nationally. And we do include this in their evidence when considering their evidence gathering around achievement. So we just have to think really carefully about the methodology, the renewed framework, and thinking through that whole idea about context underpinning this, and leaders being really clear when they're sharing that with us as inspectors, particularly in that initial call when you're talking through the planning stages of the inspection. Tim, Muro, are there any other comments or any other questions? I think we've covered a lot of the questions in the chat bar through the main themes.
Yeah, I'm just having a scan through now, but I think most of what's emerged through there that I can see has been answered. Obviously, if anyone's got any further questions, they can always get in touch with us to answer those at another point. Anything from you, Muro?
I've seen a couple about a bit more detail on the methodology. So as I mentioned in the presentation, DfE are releasing a more detailed technical guide, which we've helped feed into, and that's coming out next week. And also some questions about the release date, and we're planning at the moment for a release on the 1st of September.
Great, thank you. And of course, we've always said about that transparency with our training. So we will be making sure that our training is available to the sector after completion in September. So you will hear and see what we are delivering to inspectors and what we inspect when we, and what we expect from our inspectors during that time. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. And if there are any questions, please do get in touch with us, and we will do our best to either signpost or respond to them as fully as possible. Thank you.